In this episode of the 340 Banter podcast, Felicity joins Chelsea and I in discussing manufacturer restrictions. We will discuss the history of what's happened in the last 5 years, the mitigation efforts that health centers and other covered entities have used during that time, as well as what we see coming in the future for manufacturer restrictions. Since we're about 5 years into manufacturer restrictions, it seems hard to believe. I think it's really good to talk about where we've been and where we've kind of come from. Like I said, about 5 years ago, we started seeing these first restrictions come, and we've seen a lot of evolution of what those look like. We're now up to, at the time of recording, 37 manufacturers that have restrictions. But what we've seen is that the restrictions have really changed over the course of time, and some manufacturers even changing their own policies. So we're seeing different methods of restricting, picking different manufacturers or different covered entities to restrict their policies to, and different methods for restoring contract pharmacy access for some of the manufacturers. So I think we're now at a point, it's very interesting to see where we've been, but also where we're going.
I think one of the biggest changes to me is that the early on restrictions, most covered entities had two options. If they didn't have an entity-owned pharmacy, they could designate one contract pharmacy, just designate, or they could maintain access to pricing at all of their pharmacies by submitting claims data through the 340B ESP platform. To now we're predominantly in the land of for many of the manufacturers, there's no way to regain access to all of the pricing. And then for that single designated pharmacy, you have to submit claims data for that pharmacy in order to actually still be able to gain access to pricing there. And it's such a stark contrast between the two. And I know that is a big challenge for covered entities that initially, chose not to submit claims data. They were okay with just designating the single pharmacy and really having to face the decision point now of, it looks like it may be inevitable. But I think that's for me,
and more manufacturers.
Biggest,
Yeah, it's been really hard. We've seen this evolution, and it's been interesting, right? Because people who were in the program prior to the restrictions, they knew a different world. We've seen some covered entities who have come in while the restrictions have been in place, and this has been their reality. And then others who we've encountered who are just looking at maybe getting into contract pharmacy for the first time, newer covered entities in the program, or maybe they've had their own entity-owned pharmacy, but saying, how do we create access for our patients? And the way contract pharmacy looks is really different if you're able to access the manufacturers by navigating the restrictions or not. I mean, we've seen as stark as 95% if you're able to designate and data share, maybe being able to restore that, or 5% of the program is there if you're not.
And we've seen a lot of covered entities come into this, and the program was a lot easier 5 years ago. I think when we all came into the program, it looked vastly different. But now a lot of covered entities are struggling to stay on top. I struggle to stay on top of the manufacturer policies. There's so many that I have to look it up every time.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest game changers, particularly for grantee covered entities, really that being who we work with the most frequently. But Felicity, I know that you poured a lot of time and heart and soul into kind of gathering the different stakeholders involved as the manufacturer restrictions were starting to change, particularly honing in on the fact that grantee entity sites don't have that parent-child relationship that hospitals have, that each grantee associated site is a parent site. It is individually 340B eligible as opposed to relying on that, parent hospital where you have the child sites there. Can you talk us through kind of the evolution of that process and what it's meant for a lot of, really, we work with health centers predominantly, so what it's meant for them?
Yeah, I think in the early days, right, we heard some conversations about people who thought maybe there was some sort of loophole or some, backdoor opportunity for people to take advantage of something. And that's where we get really concerned, right?
Yeah.
We do not want to be looking at any sort of loophole. We want to make sure that if we're talking in the space, that it is something that is sanctioned by the manufacturers, because anybody who's doing this work, right, it's a lot of effort to build your program to make sure that it's both compliant with HRSA's expectations and compliant with the manufacturer's expectations too.
Yeah.
So we did a lot of research into the manufacturer's policies and procedures for each of the restrictions so we could understand what those looked like. Then we went and worked with the third-party administrators to say, what can you do in your systems? Here's our understanding of the manufacturer policies, and can we help you get up to speed so that you can accommodate what the manufacturers are doing, which is for the grantees, one contract pharmacy or one entity on pharmacy per registered site. Yep. And then from there, once we started to start having the system take form, working with the wholesalers to make sure that they had the infrastructure in place, HIBIC. It's lovely to see HIBIC is now, I don't know if they've upstaffed or they're up to speed, but we're seeing the turnover become much quicker. I know when we first started working on getting the new health industry numbers of the HINs, it was a few days to weeks. And then we went out to months and almost a year for that.
Before this, no one knew what a HIN or HIBIC was.
Yeah. And then now we're back to short timelines and, just really bringing all of the different stakeholders together to say, we do have a way to navigate this through what the manufacturers have created. Is it optimal? No. Do we love it as the covered entities? No. But this is what we have to work through. And then the last piece was we really worked to make sure that the Office of Pharmacy Affairs was aware, because we had to change the registrations. So communicating, especially in those first few registrations, here's what we're doing, here's why we're doing it, so that when the Office of Pharmacy Affairs reviewed them, it didn't create confusion to them. And then that information was also there when the HRSA audits were happening, so that the auditors would be aware of it too. So there's a lot of behind the scenes work that went into it, but it's been very impactful for the covered entities.
The OPACE changes have been a difficult concept for many to grasp, particularly because for so long, the direction has always been, have all of your contract pharmacies listed under your one site. For the hospitals, it's their main site. For the grantees, it's one of their sites that they didn't register them on OPACE through all. They have the same language in their contract pharmacy agreements that everyone has that says that it's the sites registered on OPACE.
My health center, we had them originally registered under every site. And because of the old policy, I recommended we move that.
Yeah, because the guidance was to only have them listed on one.
Now we're shifting back a different direction.
I think it's helpful from the covered entity standpoint to recognize how many other players there are. Like you talked about the wholesaler, the manufacturer, the TPAs, and now everything going through 340B ESP. They all need one source of truth, and OPACE is that source of truth. So even though, yes, one of the sites within the organization had all the contract pharmacies listed on it, there's no way for them to all point back to that same place. And I mean, HIBIC as well needs to be able to see that. So kind of remembering that, again, as you said, is it optimal? Is it how we want to be doing things? No, but is it the opportunity we have available to us? Yes. And how do we make sure that we're doing that in a way that works for all parties involved?
Yeah. And I think that is really the key, right? Because there's so many different moving pieces, and we were so lucky to have just different stakeholders who were willing to go on that journey with us. We had some covered entities who piloted it with us, right? Because we weren't 100% certain, was this going to work? Was it going to function as we thought it would? And then to be able to share that story across the space, I lovingly refer to this as our Volvo 3-point harness, right? When Volvo created the seatbelt, they released it to the world. And this was too impactful for us to keep a secret or only talk to our clients about, right? We needed to make sure that everybody in the space understood how to do it.
Yeah.
And so that they could also strengthen their safety net.
I think I talked to more people that weren't our clients than were just friends in the program. That's just what we do. We help the FQHCs, but it's a challenging process to get through, but it can restore so much access.
Yeah.
Sorry, you go ahead.
I was gonna say, one of the things that we've seen most recently, right, is when you're changing your designation now and just making sure you think through the complexities of that unwind. Not only, are you changing the pharmacy that you're designating, but if you're thinking about maybe moving something back or, just making sure you have all of those additional details worked through. That's something that I know that you're thinking about as you're starting to be leading this side of the service. But I think that's one of the nuances that when we first built it out, where it's like, okay, what's the roadmap to get there? But now that we're here, how do we navigate within it is a new challenge.
I think particularly as we see most of the manufacturers that require claims level data are looking for the alignment of the purchases and utilization at the single pharmacy level and not necessarily at the network level, which is a challenge for larger pharmacy groups that may use a central replenishment model. So they're kind of accumulating to all of the pharmacies that entity is contracted with. And then the next one that needs that drug can purchase, which for them works operationally pretty well for their inventory management. It makes sense. But the pharmacy that's purchasing the drug isn't necessarily utilizing the drug. So we're seeing now many of the manufacturers where covered entities were able to regain access to 340B pricing for their designated pharmacies, that's starting to go away because they're getting negative balances at those pharmacies where they're making their replenishment purchases, but they don't necessarily have the matching dispense data to go with that. So they're looking at, okay, every 12 months we can change the pharmacy. We're coming up on that time. Do we need to be thinking a quarter ahead of time to register that other pharmacy on OPACE? What additional, HIN changes need to be made? Again, pulling in your TPA and your wholesaler for those changes. And then to your point, Felicity, if you decide to move that wholesaler account back to your other site that had all of your contract pharmacies on it originally, working closely with your wholesaler and TPA to make that transition happen, you'd still theoretically have an HIN for the original alignment that you can revert back to. So you shouldn't have that lead time that you had the first time. But there are also entities that are choosing to kind of leave that pharmacy and that account kind of aligned with this other, 340B ID, this associated site. Is definitely not at all straightforward.
No, and we've seen a lot of pharmacies close recently, which I know I had a client that was affected by that because they had some designations to a pharmacy that closed. So then we had to go back to the drawing board and say, what do we put here?
And you can, in that instance, you don't have to wait 12 months if the pharmacy closes, but you have to worry about your OPACE registrations and a new HIN if you're moving it over to another site. So like more lead time again.
Yeah. I think we've talked about designations a lot and how we're navigating these restrictions that way. But we're also seeing a lot of state laws that are helping us navigate the restrictions. So starting with Arkansas, but we're now above 8 states that have passed laws. And they've actually been very effective. We've seen a lot of different variations on the laws, and I think there are challenges with each one. Some they're not all made equal, but I think it's something we're seeing. And I believe at the time of recording, we've had 11 or 12 just in 2025 that have already announced, introduced laws or bills to address this. So far, we've been successful in litigation, except with one exception. And now that we're seeing a court case in West Virginia rule in the favor of the drug makers.
Preliminarily,
yeah, it's creating some challenges.
And we're as a result of that, seeing some manufacturers draw back their exemptions or walk back their exemptions for West Virginia and
Kansas.
Sorry, I was like, I know there's a second one. I couldn't come up with it. Yes, Kansas. So it's really tough, particularly for the covered entities who had just been able to reestablish all that access and now have to go back through the same designation and claim submission process that they would have had to previously.
Yeah. So the nuance with West Virginia is that unlike many of the other cases that we've seen for the other states, where either we've had a ruling that's come back in the state's favor or a preliminary finding from the judge where they've said, based on what we've seen so far, we believe we're going to rule in favor of the state. In the case of West Virginia, they said, no, we believe we're actually going to rule in favor of the pharmaceutical manufacturer and that it has the way that the law is written, it impacts pricing and not the delivery of drug. And so there's still an opportunity for the case to be heard and for the judge to be convinced a different way. I think, it'll be interesting to see what happens as the arguments are made. And there's the hope, maybe there'll be others who intervene in the case now that the judge has said, he believes he's going to rule one way to support the state. But that's where there's a lot of concern. The other with the state of Kansas, because the way that was passed for the state, it was in a more of a financial vehicle, a budgetary vehicle, and it only had a 2-year clock anyway. And so it was set to phase out at the end of 2 years. And because there was also some language written into the law that said, if you could not show harm directly at the patient level, it really couldn't be enforced. It was a lot more difficult. And so the Attorney General said the way that the law was written, it in and of itself could not be enforced. And so the Attorney General, when the manufacturers took it to the courts, said, based on how this is written currently, I cannot enforce this law. Therefore, this lawsuit is null and void. So Kansas, even though it was not a win, it's also not necessarily considered a loss in the same way a true loss would be, because the bill just wasn't robust enough to be defensible.
I had no idea. I apparently spaced out in the past around the 2-year timeline. I did not know that Kansas had that 2-year timeline.
Yeah, and it depends on the state. There were other states considering putting it in their budget that would make it permanent. So it's really important that if you're working on these bills, that a couple things. I would say work with your primary care association, with your state hospital association to really make sure that you're addressing the concerns. Also, reach out to people in the lawyers that know how to cross these bridges. But I think something else that a lot of covered entities didn't realize is that it still kind of goes back to that ESP, because a lot of the states, to restore the access, they still have to submit claims. And that was something the early bills didn't prohibit. So I think that that's important for covered entities to know that it may still be required.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons West Virginia is so critical, is because it is the most comprehensive in the data restrictions. And so I think we'll see a large fight in that court case because of how nuanced that bill is.
I've seen a lot of bills modeled after West Virginia now too, at the end of the 2024 session, especially. So it'll be interesting to see what states do going forward, if they model it after West Virginia's more strict language, or if they go a little lighter to model some of the previous states.
The bill that's being introduced in Maine this session has very similar data language to what was in West Virginia.
I think that it's kind of in the same vein around litigation, not legislation, but litigation around manufacturer restrictions is the proposed rebate/credit models. And particularly, there's so many aspects of it, but I think the ones that we're hearing the most, questions about and concerns about from covered entities are around kind of two factors. One is actually when they get that credit or that rebate back to them and how they're going to be able to manage their operating budget. And the other being operationalizing the data, because it is so much more expansive than what we're seeing right now through just 340B ESP, because it's not just for your contract pharmacy relationships, it's your entity-owned pharmacies, it's your physician and clinic administered drugs, depending on the manufacturer and the platform. And for hospitals, where all three of those are predominantly or commonly managed through a third-party administrator. And so there's some logic that can be used in pulling the information and reporting it out, and even in some ways potentially submitted directly from the TPA to the platform. For health centers, really, they all predominantly use TPAs for their contract pharmacy arrangements, but it is quite rare to have a grantee. Sorry, I said health center because that's who we work with the most frequently, but for grantees in general. And then if you think about your smaller hospitals, your critical access hospitals, they might not be using TPAs for their entity-owned pharmacies or their physician-administered drugs either. So I know on many covered entities, even though things are on hold with these proposed models right now, given the litigation, they're still thinking about how are we going to get this information and how are we going to submit it and track it back. I know that you are of our group here, our in-house or entity-owned pharmacy guru. So can you talk a little bit about what health centers that you're working with are thinking about, just to make sure that if the switch does get flipped, they're ready?
I think one of the things I have recommended, it's something I did for my own entity-owned pharmacy, is looking at the financial impact. If the Apexis historical purchase report is an extremely powerful tool that you can use to estimate what that impact's going to be. One of the impacts is going to be your daily purchases. I was able to estimate that ours was going to go up about $20,000 a day in increased purchases. Yes, you're going to get that difference back, in theory, through the rebate, but you're going to have to wait for that. And I think one thing that wasn't accurate in some of the letters I read from the manufacturers was that you'll get the rebate prior to the time that you have to pay your wholesaler. And it wasn't at least accurate with the way wholesaler agreements work today.
The assumption of net 30.
Yeah, and most of our health centers and definitely our hospitals are not on net 30.
No.
They're paying much sooner than that. The other thing I really have thought about is the operation of a rebate model. And inside of a entity-owned pharmacy, it really becomes real because we're providing that discount to our uninsured patients up front. How are you going to operationalize that? How are you going to provide that discount when you don't know what the price is? Because all of our prices in our pharmacy software come from the wholesalers, which are no longer going to be 340B pricing. So there's only going to be the ceiling price tool in OPACE, which only 2 people can access.
And it's not reportable.
And thank goodness it exists now.
Yes,
It
it's great.
It didn't for the longest time.
But you search one drug at a time. It's not something
You can't
that you
download a report.
Yeah.
And that also brings up some concerns with operationalizing Medicaid submissions, because we are required to submit our actual acquisition cost, and we're not going to know what that 340B ceiling price is. So it's making challenges that we're not sure how we're going to work through with the pharmacy software.
Yeah,
I was just going to say the other important thing to think about is just, purely the data elements that would be requested. And there are some pharmacy operating softwares that have incredibly customizable reports. That you'd be able to go in and build that report today if you wanted to. You'd still have to manually run it and upload it to the designated platform, because right now there's 2 that are proposed. But some of the pharmacy operating software doesn't have the user customizability for reporting. So it's probably a good idea now to work with your vendor representative for your POS system and work with them to say, okay, is this a report or is this information we can get through reports already?
Yeah.
And if not, can you guys work on building a report
That's a
now
great idea.
in case that time comes, so we're not scrambling at, when the time comes, if it does come.
Yeah.
To your point, Logan, right? I think that many of the manufacturers have cited the Inflation Reduction Act and their requirement for compliance with the maximum fair prices and being not required to be subject to both a 340B price and a maximum fair price as one of their rationales for offering these rebate or these cash-based replenishment models. But what you said about Medicaid is very valid in that there are many states where there is an expectation that those who are participating in the 340B program will pass on the actual acquisition cost. And so by moving to the rebate model where we don't have access to the actual acquisition cost up front, we are now not able to begin compliance with our Medicaid requirement. And so by shifting the model to comply with one law, we are now out of compliance with another. And I respect what the manufacturers are saying that, we have a compliance for IRA, but we also still have compliance with the Medicaid requirements too. And so creating that balance is going to be a challenge and something for us to all explore together.
I think I've also seen some states that even go further than saying actual acquisition costs, and they say 340B ceiling price. No more than the 340B ceiling price, which is even more challenging to access.
Well, at this point, I'm wondering if you guys have any kind of final thoughts or words of advice for the covered entities who are struggling through the continually changing landscape of manufacturer restrictions.
Yeah, I think lots of deep breaths. I think that as we started with, right, it's been 5 years. It's going to continue on. We're going to just keep seeing the evolution, whether it's rebate model or continued evolution within the restrictions, data sharing, designation, state laws. It's going to keep happening, and just making sure that you understand each of the different elements that are there and that you're continuously looking at your program to say, are we doing it right for today? And knowing that that's going to change on the daily, weekly, monthly basis, and then continue
every Friday at 4 p.m. Eastern.
Or
Yes.
on a holiday, or if there's a 340B conference.
Yes.
And then making sure that you adapt your program and that you're continuously checking on it, because there's so many times where you get something in order and then something changes behind the scenes, and there's just so much need for oversight all the time.
Yeah.
I think for me, it's really focusing on how you can track what the impact is to your health center or covered entity as a whole, because I think that that's going to feed into your advocacy. It's important that you're sharing the story, share the good things that you're doing, also share the struggles you're having. If you had to close a clinic or you had to downsize your workforce, those are important to know. So when you're talking to legislators and sharing that 340B story, that you have definite information to give.
I'm just going to say, remember to, you said take deep breaths. I would say remember to take a moment to focus on the wins or the positives. Yeah. I know it's really difficult at times to not be frustrated with the fact that we don't have the 340B program as covered entities that we had 5 years ago. Mm-hmm. But the reality is we're not there, and we're not going back to it. This is our reality now. So looking at the avenues that we do have to still pursue savings, and when you're able to reestablish savings in one area, take the win, acknowledge, yes, this isn't what we want or what our organization needs or what our community needs, but take a moment to take the win and acknowledge that it is a good thing, because it sometimes feels easy to get lost in the pity party that you want to throw for yourself when it feels like everyone in your organization is looking to you for why is this program not supporting our patients and our services the way it has in the past, but being able to reframe to some extent and say we're working in what our current reality is, and this is the win we got today, and we'll keep working to make sure that we're working within the expectations of the program, but also doing the best we can by our patients.
Yep. I think that's great advice.